here. Those of you who are regulars, welcome back. You will know that it's important to us. It's necessary to us. This has become part of our I don't want to call that part of it. It's part of our Friday mornings. And yet I never, ever want to take away the importance. It can't be a checklist. So when we start a Friday, if you're brand new in here, welcome as well. And we like to take the moment to acknowledge the land acknowledgement. And land acknowledgements have been happening for forever. And they're a traditional custom that's gone across many, many native nations for many, many centuries. And so one of my curiosities this year is looking at some of the more ancient oral practices. One of our daughters is studying anthropology, and she was talking about history starts when history was written. And there's so much more before that. And so that's one of the things that I keep in mind when we take this moment to recognize and acknowledge. And so today for Craig and myself, we're here in Calgary. To everybody across the country, welcome wherever you're joining us from. In Calgary, we stand, sit, move around, laugh, learn on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Treaty 7 region encompasses the Indigenous people of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and the Northwest Métis homeland. SAIT acknowledges all the people who make their home in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. Wherever you are, thank you for joining us in acknowledging. These people have resided here since time immemorial, and it's a traditional land where we walk in the footprints of our Métis people.
Thank you, Jenny. I like that. History starts when history is written. I just popped that down because obviously it has triggered a thought for me that's taking me a little sideways for a second, but ties in well with where I think we're going today. And it's the fact that leadership doesn't start when leadership is given to you in the form of a title. Yeah. You know, what we've been trying to speak about for the last couple of years is that everybody in whatever role they are in is a leader. They can start leading at any time. So leadership doesn't have to be given for you to be a leader. And I think today might be, again, a little bit different. We're going to dive into some topic and have some conversation, obviously, with all of you. But one of the things that we have been leaning into these Friday mornings for the last couple of years now, it is really to help organizations and individuals understand how SAIT can help you develop your leadership and develop your team and your organization's leadership skills. And a lot of the content that we've been pulling on here is really tied into a program that Jenny has developed, along with others now providing input, like Heather McMillan, who has recently joined us on these conversations, but looking at what we've defined the intelligences of leadership. And yes, intelligence is a word. Once we got our heads wrapped around intelligences, we realized this was a really good framework to pursue. And my ask, quite frankly, is, you know, as you go through, if you're thinking about your organization or your own leadership development, remember that we're here to potentially help, right? SAIT Corporate Training has a role that we can play in helping individuals and organizations upskill and reskill. And so I'll leave that there. But this whole piece around intelligence, Jenny, I looked it up this morning, and Merriam-Webster, for those of you who remember dictionaries, Merriam-Webster, because I think we just Google meanings of words now, don't we? But intelligence is the ability to learn or understand or to deal with new or trying situations. And what struck me about that is I think it fit very well with our approach to leadership when we're, you know, especially the new or trying situations. And the fact that this is more about how to think about it than it is to say, here's what you do. So Jenny, maybe we can springboard off of that and see where this takes us today.
Okay. I like that definition, actually. That really works well. And I think one of the things, this conversation first started between you and I in the early days of the pandemic, I believe, like March 2020, wherever that was, and from there on. And one of the things that the pandemic, there was good, in a way that came from it. But the good for us in that was there was no playbook. And people, we weren't brilliant before we all got sent home, but all of a sudden we had people not knowing, they didn't even have a clue where to start. And anything that had been sort of offered before in that whole leadership book, it just didn't exist for what we were looking at. And what hit us really hard as we were discussing is this is more about how. And the more that you talk about how, the what becomes fairly easy. You've always got your why, for those who love that starting point. Yes, absolutely. But in that how, there's so many different ways that we can approach it. And what I love about where we've got to now is that we're really able to meet people where they're at. And so for, it's not so much here's how you run a meeting, it's how are you going to get your people to speak? How do you get your people to contribute? How do you get the best ideas out of that room? And when you've looked at that as a whole in a holistic way, you can apply it in so many different situations. And what we're learning now too is you can do that face to face, and you can do that virtually, and you can do that when you're all separated. Yeah. So that's kind of a cool part for me. And I'm going to surprise you here because I'm going to use a slide. And that's not a normal thing on a Friday morning either. But I really like
this. Fascinating, Jenny. How fascinating.
And that is, before, when we used to look at leadership, to your point, I think this is what I sort of heard you say within there too, is it was so strategic. And if you did this, then this was your next play, and then this was your next play. And we played a set game. And today, especially with our shift towards employee experience and our care for that human being in front of us, we're not numbers, and we're not, just a resource. We're a human first. Leadership is much more about creating that environment. And if you create the right environment, then everything can flourish. And how you create that environment is not the same in every single organization. So one of the things that I can always promise you is we're not going to talk a leadership model. There's loads of great leadership models.
Yeah.
We don't fit them perfectly. There we go.
Yeah. And I love the way you've leaned into leadership is changing. And I'd be curious, folks, if you have a second and you're so inclined, drop your thoughts in the chat around what have you seen change either from your leaders in the last couple of years, or if you're a leader yourself, how you've had to adapt and change. And obviously there's going to be some very practical pieces around, some of us had to make the shift to leading virtually versus in person. I'm sure there's many of you on the line that, through all of this have been face-to-face still. But even then, you're dealing, to Jenny's point, you're dealing with different issues. You're dealing with, back in the early days of the pandemic, obviously, perhaps lots of anxiety, other issues that folks are experiencing around that. So I'm curious to know what you've seen change over the last while. Recognition of individual differences and needs. I think we've seen a huge piece related to that, right? There's been a lot more, how do we put this, tailoring, I suppose, of leadership styles to individuals on the team.
That's our favorite, like one size does not fit all.
No,
like, that's your washing instruction. It's different.
Right. So what you're saying is, one size does not fit all is the washing instruction, and we have moved on to that versus lather, rinse, and repeat. Right.
There you go. Yeah, so, absolutely. And actually, that's a cool piece, because sometimes people come and I find myself, like, I'll meet 125 people easily in a week, and some will come and they just would like this intellectual solution. But the problem, if we put a solution like this, is you're putting it on top of, this bit high, you're putting on top of little humans. And we're emotional human beings. We're messy. We've said this recently too. And so we collide off each other, we bounce. And I'm just putting a blanket solution across an entire group of people, whether that group of people is 3 or 33 or 303, it's not going to work that well. And there's a place for process and compliance. Like, I absolutely get it. But we have to be aware of that as we look at it.
100%. Some great comments coming in here, and thank you, April. Certainly appreciate that. But Lisa, your comment around, I saw leadership become more compassionate, but now I see another change where there's a strong forced push to have everyone back in the office. So very interesting. I think we can dive into that a little bit. Seen lots more recognition of other leadership styles. Big difference between being in person and leading virtually. Virtually seems harder. It is. Increased focused on diversity, inclusion, and belonging, 100%. Honesty, improved transparency, and humbleness to have leaders admit they do not have all the answers. Absolutely. And Dean, the comment about curiosity, leaders becoming more curious. We touched on that last week with Tyler in our conversation. And so, Jenny, I think what I'm seeing here already is some of the pieces that tie into the framework, right? Around social intelligence, around emotional intelligence. So maybe we could kind of perhaps touch on, give everybody kind of that recap of the 6 intelligences that we believe that we should focus on. And again, folks, this is our approach. This is our framework. We are more than open to folks liking, loving, or agreeing with us in the chat. If you don't, we'll skip that today. No, but seriously, if you don't agree, feel free to challenge.
So it's cool that you said that. We'll get there in a second. What you're seeing in front of you is a journey, effectively. Like, this is one of the things that makes it really difficult. How do you do this on a flat screen, when really what we're talking about is a sort of a continuum, a journey that we go on with our audiences who come. But there is a method in the madness. And so as you're looking at the screen, the intelligences run with their icons, and you can see where we started. Everyone has a nice little icon there, and then there's this star at the end. So the last one originally was digital intelligence, and we learned from our early audiences we didn't actually need that one. And it's not that it's not important. There's so much provision, support, different conversations, different ways to go about it. It wasn't fitting the conversation that we were having throughout the journey. And so it has a star because it doesn't have an icon yet, but strategic intelligence, we feel at the minute it was the part that was missing. And I'll get to what each one is in just a second. But I think the important part when we talk from our world is, in the past, you would have come and you'd have hung out with me, any of my great colleagues that also deliver in this area, and you'd have had a great day, and you'd have gone home, and the next day you'd have gone back to work, and it would have been just the same. And it took a real commitment to take anything from the day and put it into practice. And the other part too is when we talk about all of this within a classroom setting, you lose that real life version of it. And I often hear that people say, oh, that was great, and it'll never ever work. Well, that's an excellent thing to hit, because then we can talk and we can dig into that. So what we've built within this journey when you come with us is, right from the start, in between each of these, we're connecting. And we're connecting and we're supporting, so that when you go back to the environment that you work in, we're going to help you transfer that learning, is the technical speak, into place. And so that's what the arrow down the bottom there is for. And just to run, I'm going to try and do this quickly without being too quick as an overview. The leader in me starts off with, who are you? And we can dive back into these at any time, Craig, or you can stop me mid-run if you like.
You bet.
But if you don't know who you are, there's no way you're going to understand what your leadership looks like. And to your excellent point at the beginning, leadership is a behavior, leader is the role. So you can start this at any time. Even if leadership's way off your radar at the moment, you're still leading in certain places. But that quote at the top from Brené Brown, who you are is how you'll lead. That really ties to, do you know yourself? And not just what you look like in the mirror. Do you know yourself when you're under pressure? Do you know yourself when you're being challenged? Do you know yourself when you're in a critic? So we spend a day just getting sort of sorted and orientated. And then we begin on our intelligences. I will do these faster. Psychological safety and trust to us is the foundation. If you don't have that, it's really difficult to do any of the things that we're required to do. And we often say, everything boils down to conversation. If I trust you in a conversation, my contribution, how I show up and what I'll give is so much different than if I don't. And so trust is between us. Psychological safety is the environment that we're creating for the team, the organization. From there, and it looks like my slides were missing emotional intelligence. So pause for a second. In there would be emotional intelligence. Here's where we admit our failures. Craig, there's a slide missing. And emotional intelligence is simply as it sounds. How are you intelligent with your emotions? We use EQI at SAIT, but we look at dealing with intensity. We look at empathy. Everybody's talking about empathy at the moment. Is empathy productive or unproductive? If you're being unproductive in it, how do you make yourself productive with that empathy? Everybody wants to be heard, seen, and understood. Collaborative intelligence, you've now had time to read the definition, and there's not much more to say than that definition from Marquardt. Everybody's asking for collaboration nowadays. They want a high-performing team that can collaborate and innovate. And collaboration is A, one of the most social processes, and B, you have to understand and be able to connect with your people to be able to even start. Our social intelligence, now that we're back on track, is all about culture, all about the humans on your team, and how do we build that, renovate it, change it. A little bit in there on those one-on-one conversations that can be so difficult for people. And that takes us straight into adaptability. And what we know now is there's constant change. And so adaptability is all about that. How do you deal with the whitewater when it comes? How do you lead through change? Really different than change management. And then after that is the big unknown. We're writing it again right now. It's in the middle of it. We'll be looking at strategic intelligence, but I can't give you any information yet because we're still playing with what that will look like.
We're building that strategy as we speak.
Yeah, there you go.
So there's been some great comments rolled past, and folks, again, that was to give you a simple idea of the framework that we've developed here. And based on some of these comments, I want to perhaps double click on something. And because I think we're experiencing this right now with our own team here. And as we look at what we're doing across SAIT, but I'm hearing that the push to come back to office for culture that no longer exists and it isn't being nurtured. So in other words, the concept being, we've got to get folks back face to face. We got to get folks back in the office to, create our culture. What does that trigger for you?
So there are numerous things. It's going to depend on the organization. There's a couple of misalignment is actually the first thing that it triggers. So some people are doing it really well. When it's done really well, what's happened, and this is social intelligence, just so that we're sort of clear on it, and a little bit entering into the collaborative maybe, is what is the reason for bringing people back? And so I think one of the first things that hopefully has happened is that leaders are looking really carefully. If I'm asking people to come back, is there value in them being there? And so, if the value on your wall is flexibility and you are demanding people to be at work every single day, those two are misaligned. And then you're going to get pushback. You're going to get people who are disinterested. If the reason for bringing people back is so that they can sit in a cubicle where there's no value in them being there, and now they have to commute 1 hour one way and 1 hour the other way, or even if it's just half an hour, it's still an hour out of the way. And all they're doing is the same thing that as they would do at home. I'm going to question that. That's misaligned. It doesn't make sense to lose that time. And I think in the culture piece, the opportunity that's being missed, and this can come down to leaders, we often wait. We wait for it to cascade all the way down. But as a leader, you still hold the culture of your team. People will leave or join you, period. And so what do you need to do with your team and their culture? What's the conversation that's missing? And then how does that fit into the big picture? And it's difficult to generalize because you don't have a choice. I mean, you always have personal choice. You've said that many times to us, Craig, but in other places, there is a conversation there. And we're seeing this a lot. Here's our preference, but leaders, you be in charge of your team. You know what's best for your team. That's almost ideal. Yeah.
And Lisa, great comment in here is that you can't force culture. Exclamation point. That's a good use of an
Yeah.
exclamation point. I will agree. And then, but poses the question also, does sitting face to face automatically mean you're more collaborative? Right?
No.
It's not that simple. So when we talk about culture, and this is something that I've been thinking about, struggling a lot with lately, is how do you intentionally build culture? It is, it's this thing that, does culture emerge, or can you be intentional about creating it? And how do you create a culture on a team within an organization that maybe isn't focused on creating a culture, or who's just saying, we need people back because our culture is suffering, when you probably couldn't even define right now what the culture is of that organization as it exists. So I'm curious, there's a lot in there. Can you intentionally create culture, and how do you go about it?
So to come back to, will it emerge? You have personalities on your team, something will emerge. I would struggle to say that's your culture. That's your people. Culture is very intentional. And that's the part that often gets missed. And the other, I think the most important starting point is, who do we want to be as a team? Who do we want to be? Because there are so many different versions of culture, and you cannot be them all. You really can't be them all. So the starting point is, what's the purpose? Why are we here? What's our value? What's our impact? What do we want that to look like? And then from there, I'm going to use that term again that we picked up from Tyler a couple of weeks ago. What are your observable behaviors that will lean into that culture? And the key is, that's a team conversation. And the reason that this doesn't happen, because that's going to take some time, and we might disagree, and it might be uncomfortable for a while. But if we can align on that as a team, and we know what our purpose is, what our values are, where we have our impact, it actually helps us to prioritize in what we do during the day. But if you can name what those behaviors look like as a leader, your opportunity to catch people doing things right will grow. And, human to human, you catch me doing something right, and you tell me, I am not going to frown at you and say, I hate my job. Like, I'm just not going to do that. And so you start to build the human stuff, as well as what will lead to that value, that purpose, and the impact. And then here's the key. That has to happen every day. Like, it is 100% intentional. Yeah. And you can, we can design social intelligence different ways to help that not be such a heavy lift. Like, the thought is, as leaders, we have to take all of this. Well, no, not necessarily. We are a team. How do we work that on our team? And the more that we team, the stronger that we get. And then the other part within it is, that recognition, that appreciation. When people feel valued, like, we all have this innate need to be seen, heard, and understood, or Brené Brown would use seen, heard, and valued for connection. But when we feel that, we are much more likely to do better work. And just this week, we ran a conversation in a room. What do you bring to the organization? Here's what I appreciate about you. And 3 times organically at the end of it, that was fun. We ought to do this more often when we're not in here. We don't do this enough. And so, because we're caught in this constant, get it done, be busy, fill your calendar, we don't make time for it. So the answer to your question is yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Couple of comments in here that I wanted to pick up on, and I think it's sorry, I have to scroll back up. You have been prolific in the chat this morning, folks. Thank you so much. Lynn, I love this comment. I feel like leaders are missing the point when pushing people back to work. Leaders need to understand that for people, it's about the autonomy, the perception of having agency over how employees do their work, which includes freedom over where they work. 100%. I think that ties into our, one of the frameworks here around psychological safety, right? Our leaders and organizations, focused on bringing people back into the office because, there's this perception now that productivity is lagging, or that, I'm here because my role needs me to be here, but you're not, still not. There's something in there. And there was a recent article about the federal government struggle with this. There's been lots of agencies in the federal government forcing people back to the office, but in typical government fashion, there's many offices that no longer exist because they canceled leases during the pandemic, and folks are being forced to come back into the office. Some of them are working off the floor of all places. They're popping a corner and working off the floor. So it's this whole piece around how do you ensure, we come together to work to create outcomes.
Yeah.
Right. We don't come to work to do activity. That's terrible English.
It's okay. It's Friday and you're here.
It is, right? It is Friday. But you have to, the focus on outcomes, I think, is something that some organizations really struggle with because it doesn't necessarily fit the mindset of this is how we've always done it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Yeah. But thoughts on that?
So I think let's go back a little bit to what you said about the productivity isn't there. I don't believe that's a work at work or work from home conversation. I believe that's a leader and an employee conversation. If the productivity is not there, have the conversation.
100%.
That's a performance part, and in that's important actually. In all of this, the number one goal is performance and accountability. Like, this is not about having your besties at work. Like, when we do real work, it's gritty. When we do real work, we're going to misalign ourselves. We're going to disagree. We have to disagree. We can't get to better if we don't get all that good perception. So that productivity, that's a conversation. And I think the interesting part is that for some, and we see, Craig, you and I see lots and lots of different organizations, and it's done. But some went home, and I still know one or two that when we meet virtually, the cameras are off the whole time.
Yep. Well,
no, you're not going to get connection that way. Like, if you're constantly, what do they call that? I've lost the words. It's Friday. But if it's a transaction, if it's constantly transaction, you're going to lose your culture, because I'm not going to be connected. I'm simply doing a job. And hello, if I'm not being recognized or valued, and I'm not saying you have to recognize people for doing their day job, but a lot of us go above and beyond just within the day job. Okay, that's our general aim, is to do better. Well, then of course we're going to switch off, and I can see how that comes about. But really, the onus is in what's your cadence of communication? What are you doing to connect with your people? And let's really understand, what is your role? What is that outcome? What are you looking for here? And me, if you talk about an expectation, people will do what they need to meet that expectation.
Yeah.
And in fact, we learn to do this in school. We'll cheat to make that expectation. And I don't mean that in a dark way. We'll do what we can to get it done. But if we talk about possibilities, and so the outcome is now elevated, and that's a constant conversation. Now I'm curious to that, to use our favorite word at the moment. And so the conversation changes. And I think a lot of us need to go back and really look at, what is that outcome? How are we achieving that? Have we got people in the right places? And then if that's being achieved, does it matter where we are? I don't know. Exactly.
I think the thing that you said in there that really is resonating with me in this whole bigger conversation is around performance.
Yeah.
And if the belief is you have to bring people back together so the manager or the leader can better manage performance, this is the wrong conversation, right? Mm-hmm. Your focus needs to be on your leader or your manager in that case, to say, how can we help you get the most out of your people, regardless of where they're at, right? Just because this whole concept of visible work versus output for me is a really, it's an annoying one, right? But that's because I think in my mind it becomes so simple, but that's perhaps another conversation. Go ahead.
There's the point, because it is simple, right? Just do your job. It is simple. And then how does that simple get translated? Because there's a clarity in the conversation there. And I think that's another piece that we're picking up really quickly, is how effective are the conversations that we're having? And this sounds exhausting, but, you know, and I'm not talking about you and I jump on here at 10 to 8 in the morning. We're not too worried how effective we are in that conversation. But you and I are talking about, you know, a delivery or a plan or the next version. What's the next iteration of this? That's an important conversation. And if in any way I or you are holding back, or you're not talking about your expectations, or those numbers aren't clear, like, you know, I've said to you 101 times, I'm allergic to numbers for a really good reason, and I don't do them, which is good too. That doesn't mean I don't want to talk numbers, and that doesn't mean that I don't understand what that means, but that could cause our conversation to do this. And so it's that clarity, and often I feel leaders, like, let's be honest here too, many are exhausted. Like there is a ton of exhaustion out there.
Absolutely, especially for middle managers, right?
Yeah,
who are absorbing it from above and from below.
And that's a pressure. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think there's a number of comments here, and again, folks, thank you so much. This has been, I've been watching the chat here. There's some really good stuff coming in here, but what's really emerging as a bit of a theme in here, Jenny, and maybe we can dive into it a little bit in the next 10 minutes or so, is around psychological safety.
Okay.
Right. That again, it's one of the intelligences that we talk about. But how do you, I don't know. I'm just seeing lots of good chat here. So maybe I'll turn that to you to say, okay, here we go. Psychological safety and go.
Okay, I'm not reading the chat because it moves too quickly and I can't do, you're good at that. But psychological safety, and so in a nutshell, there's Tim Clark came out with it. There's 4 levels that we look at. So when we talk psychological safety, the pinnacle of psychological safety is, can you challenge the status quo? So if in your organization you hear the words career limiting move, or that's career suicide, you don't have any psychological safety. And when we talk psychological safety, we're building that environment so that people can speak up. And so your individual professional contributors can say to your directors, your SVPs, if that's the connection that they're in, like whatever that looks like, are you sure? I think we missed a point, or this went wrong. Today we missed a slide. Okay. So when we look at psychological safety, the beginning of it all is inclusion safety. And that ties really closely to all the, in most cases, excellent EDI work that's going on. But inclusion safety basically says you belong here. And we don't do very well in that space straight away. Like, you know, we hire adults and then we treat them like kids, and we parent them, or we treat them like teacher, like we're the teacher and they're our student. Come back to the office, I'm going to stand over you, make sure you get your job done. Okay, we've done that, we passed that, we're still here. So inclusion safety brings you in. Cultures of belonging is another way to talk about it. And then once you've got that, once you feel that, then I'm prepared to learn. And so these aren't check boxes. You never stop with that inclusion. A lot of social capital building in that inclusion piece too. But then when we move into learner safety, I'm prepared to learn. I'm prepared to grow. And in our old way of thinking, okay, well, yes, Jenny, you're not very good at this. I think you should get better at that. Okay, that's going to suck the life out of me because there's a reason I'm not very good at it. And so where is that growth? What does that look like? And so there's, you know, it's such a big conversation around it. Biggest part in there too is destigmatizing failure. And so for leaders, you know, they often like, yeah, it's okay. My people are human. They can make a mistake. When was the last time you made a mistake? When was the last time you said it out loud? And what did you learn from it? Because if you're perfect, your team are not going to come saying, yeah, failed. Okay. But if that's part of the environment and how we deal with that, back to your how fascinating, that allows us to move forward. And then here's the piece, and I think you tied this beautifully earlier, then the next level is contributor safety. And that's where we get the autonomy from. And that's where we get to make that contribution. And contributor safety, we have to earn it. You can't arrive first day on the job and expect contributor safety. But once we've built that trust, that inclusion and that learner piece, then that contributor safety comes. And then the knock on from there is what Clark refers to as challenger safety. And then within all of that is, how do you create this space for voice? It's another really good phrase, create space for voice. What does that mean? And that really means that you are hearing from all your people all the time, whether that's in a meeting, whether that's in one-on-ones. How do you do that? And either side of that, you have to set the stage for that, and you have to be able to respond productively. There you go. You got tons of conversation in 100 sentences.
No, that was fantastic. And I believe I captured the 4 levels that you mentioned there: inclusion, learner, contributor, and challenger. So that was active listening for the purpose of making sure I got it into the chat. And so, yeah, and it's not simple work.
No.
Right. And that's the fascinating thing to me about when we get into this discussion around leadership, right? Is that I think there's a belief or an assumption out there that, you know, once you become a leader, you will be a good leader, right? And, you know, just because you have the title again doesn't mean that it comes with it. And so, yeah, it's fascinating to me. Interesting question here. Just flipping back to performance now. I've heard an argument or a counter argument that if we use outcome as our key measure, does it open the doorway of outsourcing a significant portion of the team to another country or even bots with lower costs, right? To me, it doesn't sound right, and certainly doesn't promote psychological safety, but not sure the most effective way to respond to such a comment. And so I think this is going to, for me, this one kind of stretches across. It depends on the nature of the work, right? I think we come at these conversations sometimes, Jenny, with the thought that we're in kind of in those information economy, right? We're in that thinking economy, which doesn't necessarily correspond to producing widgets or such. But my gut reaction on this one is that in a capitalistic capitalism, you're always going to find your way to lower your costs of input to create outcomes, right? And I think then it becomes the question around what's the value you can provide. If you're going to outsource those roles, how do you take the people that were doing that and they can develop the ability to provide higher level value in that equation? But
that's a part. The other thing that I'd pull us back to, which might be slightly more in the weeds than your excellent overview there, because there's a truth in that. But when we talk about goals and expectations, etc., the outcome is the highest level. So let's say, you know, SAIT wants to be world class. That's an outcome. But what sits under there is performance and process in terms of goals. And so there's always 3 levels to do it. So we aim to be this. What is it that's going to take us there? And then there's a number of different steps to get us up there. And so if you use that mountain analogy, if we have to get to the summit of Everest, we were talking about Everest earlier, if you have to get there, you know, in order to get there, there's a number of different things in that performance level. So you're going to need some kind of climbing experience, mountain experience, all that stuff sits in that performance bit. And underneath each one of those are all the tiny steps that get there. And so in our world of digital transformation and that AI and those bots and the chat GPT that seems to still be taking up so much of our time there, it's really easy to get caught in that, yep, it's all going off over here and what? But I think what we're going to keep seeing is this value of ecosystem and this value of human. And you know, Tyler Chisholm mentioned it the other week too. We have the soul, and the soul brings a different level of being, of work, of report. So some stuff, yes, it makes sense to your point, like move it on. If that frees us up to do the value, to put the importance in there. So there's at least 3 different conversations in there.
100%.
I love that Kat just said you can't outsource your climb.
No,
and nor should you. It's a fabulous place to go to. Yeah.
No, that's a great comment. And so I think, you know, as I'm looking at this, Jenny, looking at the time, I think you've got some great summary thoughts to leave folks with. And again, folks, as we look at this, we really wanted to give you some more background idea around some of the work that it is we are doing with our clients. You know, we've recently begun working with Connect First, delivering leadership development to them for the next 3 years. We're working with Parkland, ProPac, et cetera. So this framework can apply. And, you know, if we've tweaked something in your interest around leadership for yourself or for your team or for your company, please let us know. But Jenny, as always, what's your one big idea?
It's not mine this week.
No, and when I see, and when we get closer to the end, I'm going to call you out on the questions, because I know you had 3 questions, but the slide before it has 6.
Yeah, okay, we'll get there in a second.
Yeah.
Just before I talk to this slides, which actually is a similar conversation with our good friends at Calgary Public Library. There's a good link in the chat. I just noticed, I just scrolled up the leader factor that takes you to Tim Clark's work. I have a 5-minute video scribe that describes it too. So Craig, I'll send you that link and we can send it out to people who are here, which will give you the 5-minute version before you go down that rabbit hole as well, if people would like that. If you don't like that, don't click on the link. Easy peasy. So big idea today, it's not mine, came from Amy Edmondson, who is the other thought leader in psychological safety. Yes. Well worth looking into her work. When we chat, we put both very closely together. And Craig, you mentioned it well this morning. Leadership is a behavior. This can go for any of us, anybody, doesn't matter how old you are, where you are. Leadership is something that we do. Leader is a role. And so this ties in with the notion that it's changing. We're actually in the middle of a paradigm shift, and the more that we can have the conversations and help, I think the more that we'll see that new human experience, employee experience that everybody's looking for, because they vote for us when they come to work for us. So that will be a cool part to remember. So 2 applied takeaways. We try and come up with 2 things that you can take and use every time we get together here. So the first one is that idea of self-reflection, self-awareness. This is crucial, and a lot of leaders, in fact anybody, we're living in scheduled nightmare. Like our calendars are like Tetris. We don't have time to think. I can put my hand up and say there are weeks where I fly by, and then it's Friday. I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't stop at all. But what we need to remember is that how we lead, whether that's within a role or just in general, really comes from the depth of us. So right back to, you know, your story all the way along, how you've created your perceptions, your attitudes, they all have a part. John Amici said it really well, is, you know, would you recognize your soul in the dark? And when I first heard that, I'm like, oh, that's a little creepy. But when you stop and think about it, it's so true. Like what does raise my emotional intensity? There are times when it goes up there. What am I going to do about that? How will I know? And so take some time. Can you put 15 minutes in your calendar this week to just reflect? And those of you who are fairly good at this already, and we have some familiar faces in the audience today, if you're already quite good at that, who will you ask? Because we're not very good at self-assessment. So who could you ask for some feed forward? And we call it feed forward on purpose, because you want to help, lift, and elevate as you move forward. So that's our first one. And it just requires a little commitment to yourself. So here's the one. I put all my questions in here, Craig, because then I only had 3 at the end. But this is so crucial. Like, we skip so many conversations. The questions there, they're just ideas. They're just points that might drop a seed, make you think about it. But a conversation is a conversation. And you will be richer on the other side of it, especially if you're not having that conversation. So here's the next thing that you could take and do is make space for that next conversation. And I think somebody had popped this in the chat earlier, in that the exercise that I ran in the classroom. Reach out to me separately. I can give you the full thing if you like. But you know what, today, send some gratitude somebody's way. Who can you appreciate? Who could you compliment? We're not very good at compliments, but you know what? If you receive a compliment, it's a gift. Just say thank you. If somebody handed you a present, you wouldn't give it back to them. So when somebody compliments you, smile and think, oh, that's cool. And just say thank you, and just watch the connections grow. You know, catch people doing it right, appreciate the people around you, because we definitely need them. And then we finish always with 3 questions. So I stuck to 3 today, largely because I haven't done so for a long time. And so these are things that you could just contemplate. It will be 2 weeks until we're back again. I'll let Craig talk about that in a moment. But, you know, what is your contribution? How are you showing up? That's your culture. Okay, you may have seen it on the social intelligence side. People make choices. Choices make cultures. What are the choices that you're making today? People positive speaks for itself. And I love that last question. If you are a leader in a role out there, it's a great question to have in a one-on-one. Ask the question and then don't talk anymore and let them fill the space. You might be surprised to what you hear.
And hopefully they don't look at you and say you.
That would be great, because then you'd know.
Oh no, that's true. There's definitely that. Right. It's, you know, you're tweaking the thought around me. It's finding your red threads at work. And folks, that might be a future conversation that we dig into if you haven't read Marcus Buckingham's latest book. Anyway, yeah. So again, I think I touched on this. If you or your organization are interested, reach out. We'd love to have the conversation with you. And we will be back, as Jenny mentioned, in a couple of weeks. Prioritization and delegation. That's going to be, I won't be here. I've decided I'm just going to pass it along to Jenny. She can do it. Is that the right way to delegate, Jenny?
Thank you, Craig. Let's have a conversation. We'll talk.
Okay. And then at the end of the month in February, Wellington Holbrook is going to join us, and we're going to have a separate conversation about his leadership journey. And so very much looking forward to that, and thanking Wellington in advance for his willingness to join us. So Wellington's willingness. There you go. That's what we could call that episode. But I clearly need another cup of coffee. So everybody have a fantastic day, a great weekend. Stay warm. We're getting a little bit of winter back. And Jenny, as always, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for making these conversations so meaningful. And have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Have a good weekend, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Craig.
You bet.